Welcome to Flying Upstream, the podcast where we uncover the choices, practices, and wisdom that defy mainstream conventions. I'm Kristyn.
And I'm Louisa, and together we're here to illuminate the alternative paths that have shaped human experiences through the ages. In each episode, we'll examine ways to move beyond societal norms. We're passionate about how timeless wisdom and unique lifestyle choices can foster healthier, sustainable, and enriching lives.
Flying Upstream podcast. I'm your host, Kristyn, and today we've got an amazing guest, my good friend, Salem Kimball. Welcome, Salem.
Hi, everybody.
Salem is going to talk to us today about being vegan for her whole entire life. Now, a lot of other people that we've spoken to have been vegan, but they transitioned in their adulthood a little bit later in life. But Salem has a really unique perspective. So today we're going to dig into her story and what that was like as a child growing up as a vegan in a very non-vegan world back in the day, and really looking forward to hearing some of her insights. So Salem, let's just dive right in here. First, Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up vegan in a world that views animal products as the mainstream? Did you ever feel different, or were you labeled by your peers?
I mean, the obvious answer is yes. Yeah, it's a little different for me. When I was really young, I was homeschooled, and that helps a little because I feel like there's ways that you kind of bump into other people's reality more when that's something like that's not the case. I feel like the experience of being vegan from the very beginning, part of what that sort of sets as a trajectory is a questioning of the default from the very beginning, right? So, you go into a big grocery store and most of what's here is not relevant for our lives, our family's life. And so I think that part of what that meant then growing up as a child was a default questioning of what I see, whether that's like a restaurant or a grocery store or even certain social norms. I think there is the experience of being different, but there's also this starting place of like, oh, why is this the way that it is? So I'm coming in from a different place. And because I have to come in planning ahead a little bit, if there's accommodations or what's available, there's a little bit more of needing to plan, basically, anytime I'm coming into a situation.
This is helpful. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners know I'm also vegan. I've spoken about it a lot. And one of the big things that comes up often is like, yeah, it's okay as an adult. Sure, we can have a little bit more strength and confidence in who we are and knowing that if we're making a decision, it's coming from us. But as a child, that's, a decision your parents are making for you. And so the child is suffering the consequences, if you will, of whatever that decision is, good or bad.
Right.
And so that perspective is really different. And we haven't really had that. So what you're saying is really insightful.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know if that's true, but I appreciate that. I do believe that our identity as a family being vegan, even though there's ways that it's going upstream and hearing the same questions and running into the friction that causes when you go out into the world and the world goes, oh, why are you doing this differently? You are having to continually bump up to that. But I think there's also a way that can be really empowering as a child, because you're like, for me, I had a fair amount of, maybe pride's the wrong word, but it felt meaningful and important that I was a part of my family and we were vegan. It wasn't like, oh, I don't get to blah, blah, blah. It was sort of like, I am empowered with the knowledge to understand a little bit more of what's behind what we're all looking at. I feel like it was grounded in, here's why. It wasn't like, you can't have that. It was like, hey, to do that, this animal suffered or what, it was sort of like being more informed from the get-go. And so I don't feel like that was a penance, if you will. It felt like I was being given more information than most people would be if they were just on the default mode.
Yeah. I love how you explain that as feeling empowered and not just going with the flow necessarily, but having that knowledge. And so it sounds like your parents did a great job with explaining things to you, and I'm assuming in an age appropriate way, but
yeah,
that you understood. I'm curious to know if you think your parents had any strategies for teaching you and your siblings about veganism, why it was important. So not necessarily just an animal had to die for you to have this meal, but more about what was their perspective and any themes they had for you and your siblings growing up.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this earlier. To me, there's this triangle of why. And There's the personal ethical, which is, hey, if an animal doesn't need to die, I don't want them to die. There's this ethical aspect. There's this ecological aspect, which is, as a person living on the planet, does this lifestyle make sense? Is this sort of in alignment with what I see as a bigger picture? And then there's the personal, that's more health. Like, do I feel good doing this? Is my body healthy? Do I have enough energy? And to me, those are all really great reasons. And historically, my experience and sort of culture is that what gets most overplayed is the ethical, is the animal rights, is the kind of militant vegan and the tattoos and the piercings. And that's like the classic angry vegan. And that's total. I mean, ethics totally matter. But also, I think for my family, that mattered. But for them, I think it was actually more heavily oriented towards health and ecology, in this sense of like, in a big picture, does this feel like the right path for our health, for our family to thrive? And as people living on this planet, does this feel like the best way that we can be living? And so I know growing up, my dad would every now and then, intermittently, he would have a new tally for like how many animals that weren't eaten and how many, like just the impact that we were tangibly having through making the life choices that we were making. To really have that feel like this matters. Every choice that we're making matters. It all stacks up. And it's not like it matters at one point and stops mattering, or that, it has to be a particular way. It's kind of this like building over time series of choices that's in alignment, kind of.
That's really interesting how you mentioned your dad was trying to make it really tangible. And so explaining we didn't have a hamburger today, even though maybe you were at a barbecue and you could have, and that saved water, that saved lives, and making that a lot more applicable to kids and how they can understand that. I have children, as you know, and frequently asked by my daughter, especially at social gatherings, can she have birthday cake? Can she have candy bars? Can she have all the things that a lot of kids eat? And most of the time I say no, because, and I explain we're vegan, we don't eat this, but sometimes the pressure is just too much for her. And I say yes, because I try to balance out the impact of her feeling included, I guess is the way to say it, and that versus the impact on health, the planet, animals. So it's definitely tough. I'm curious if your parents and your siblings did something similar, or was it just always no?
My parents, it was always no. It was a hard no. I think for me, it's interesting because so my family, they were all vegan. I have 3 brothers and sisters. They're all vegan. My parents are vegan. My nuclear family was all vegan. And so that experience within the home was very much like this homogenous. We're all doing this thing together. And for me, the process has been different because my partner is not vegan. He's not even vegetarian. And so the process of raising my children vegan in that context, and we're very close with his family and they're also not vegan. And, so there's a lot more every day bumping into, I mean, our home kitchen is vegan, but we'll go out to a restaurant and he'll eat something that's not vegan. And so there's a continual navigating of like, some of us are doing this thing and some of us are doing this other thing that I didn't have as a kid. It's like always is us. And there was a bit of less discourse, honestly, because it was the only option. So growing up, I mean, when I had the chance, if I was at like a potluck or in church after or whatever, I would eat like sweets, like baked goods. I remember that as a kid, wanting things that had sugar in them that weren't vegan. But for me personally, I think you had sent me a question about teenage years and rebellion and stuff. And my personal relationship with what it would mean to eat an animal was never like, that was like a brick wall. I had no interest in that at any stage. But so like, I might want to go eat a muffin because it tastes like a muffin and that's exciting and it's got sugar and maybe it has egg in it. And eventually I was in college in Costco. I don't know if you ever had those Costco muffins. They like the oversized muffins. And once I figured out what the egg taste was in the muffins, I could never eat them again. I like couldn't no idea. So I didn't grow up eating cheese and egg. And so anything that actually is that, like say a cheesecake dessert, I would never eat that. When I was a kid and also through early adolescence, I would eat things that I couldn't tell weren't vegan, that were like sweets. But I never wanted to participate in food where I could tell that an animal was involved, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
I
like the
do
idea of
know.
wanting a hamburger, like I can't really fathom that. Even if everyone else was doing it, it'd be like, well, but that's a dead animal. Like to me, that is not food. It's not food. It's never been food. It's like incredibly distasteful to imagine actually eating that. I think in some ways that makes it an easier decision, right? Because for me, it's not really like, oh, do I want that? It's like, oh, I would never, like I would never want it to just make me ill. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's a little different. I think it's going to take more with my own children because there's this kind of like, well, why can't we? Especially watching their father make different choices. I feel like my parents gave me a lot of information, like lots of my mom's like, here's facts and here's information, just a lot of sharing. And I feel like I share with them to an extent, but I'm not at the same frequency that my family did. And I probably will need to ramp it up as they get a little bit older, just so that they're empowered with more like specifics and facts.
I so appreciate everything you're saying because I'm in a very similar situation where my husband is not vegan. When he's with our children, he is, but in
Mhm.
his life where he's out with his friends and at restaurants, he's not. And
Mhm.
we definitely have not had that conversation yet of daddy is not truly vegan. We've taken the approach a bit of just shying away from it, hiding it a little bit more, which
Mm.
it doesn't feel great. I don't want to hide things from my children, but I also feel like having that conversation is hard. So I'm curious to know, what has that been like for you, explaining to your kids, like, hey, we are vegan, right? And
Mhm.
you, kids and you, and dad is not. And that's okay for him to make his choices. But for us, we're not going to do that. What's that
Mhm.
like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it can be tricky. I think for me, choosing to start a family and have children, having them be vegan was like that was my starting place. Right? If I'm going to bring children into the world, they will be vegan. That's where I started from. And then in terms of navigating with them, I mean, it is a little tricky, right? Because we're both sort of infusing our children with our values and the things that matter to us. And so there is a little bit of this like, oh, it's a little lopsided that this isn't uniform across the board, that both their parents are choosing the same thing. But I feel like for the most part, maybe it's because we haven't gotten totally in the weeds. If I were to get fundamental about it, there are times where it's like, wow, I would make that same choice. And I value my partner's approach to decision making. And right now, in the process of raising my children, I want them grounded in a particular set of ethics and understanding, and specifically a foundation for their health. They are thriving and healthy, and I want them to stay that way. It's a really great question. I don't know. I think there's something about it. Like when they go out into the world, they're going to interact with many, many people who are not vegan, who make different choices all the time. I think for me, part of the process of being a healthy family together is role modeling like an acceptance and a love for people that are making different choices without that delegitimizing the ethical framework of why we're choosing what we're choosing. And
That,
they can make their own choice when they're 18, they can do whatever they want to. And that was
wow.
true in my family too. But I think for me, by this time that came, I was myself. Do you know what I mean? So it wasn't like,
Yeah.
oh, no, I'm free. It was like, I have a way of being in the world that feels right. And so it's not like, yay, I can take off the shackles. It was kind of like, oh, okay, now I start the next chapter of my life. And I'm given this array of tools to know how to keep myself well and how to feel like I'm living the best way that I can.
Mm-hmm. That's so beautiful. I want to go back to one thing you said about, instead of taking the path where you might say, well, what your father is doing is, I don't approve of that. He's eating animal products and that's, wrong. Instead
Uh-huh.
of that, I love your approach. You're saying, hey, everyone is going to do what they feel is right for them. And just like we don't want non-vegans to be judgmental of us, we're not going to be that way for other people.
Yeah.
Right? That is so beautiful because it can be tempting to say what we are doing is correct, everyone else is wrong, you should never do this. But I love that approach because that's another great lesson that you're teaching your kids, which is everyone is going to do what's right for them,
Mm-hmm.
and what's right for us might not be right for other people. Everyone is on their own path. That's so
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. Something else too that sparked something for me was you're talking about how when you turned 18, you were already on your path and really confident in who you were as a vegan. And there was no sense of, I'm free, bring on the hamburgers,
Right.
I love that. I think that part is so important to give children a sense of what that means throughout their childhood. And something that we did recently, right before school started, actually, was we went to an animal sanctuary and we got to touch pigs and chickens and turkeys and horses and sheep, right? And I was explaining to them as we go, I was like, yeah, some people eat pigs, but now you have touched a pig, you have hugged a pig, right?
Mhm.
Try to make that connection that people can't always make, where this is a living creature, this sweet animal. I mean, a lot of pigs are huge, right? The pigs that are bred for pets are tiny, but most pigs are really, really big. They're slow moving. They're not going to hurt anybody,
Mhm.
and just trying to reinforce that as they go, because I think there is a huge disconnect, especially with people who are not vegan, where they just can't make the leap, right? They don't understand the level of suffering of the animals, and not just the suffering, but the extremely poor quality of the animal products that are then being put into food. And there's a huge disconnect there too.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of what's crazy is like the default is so broken, right? That it's hard to I feel like that's people's starting place, but it's hard to step back and understand that that's a broken starting place. Like most people are
Mm-hmm.
in denial about their food journey, right? What they're eating, they don't have a sense of where it's come from. And so we've gone to farms too and seen animals, and I think seeing goats and seeing pigs and seeing them. But I think fundamentally there's also this like, oh, okay, the meat that's in the store, like that all used to be animals. I mean, we're not going into that stuff, but just the facts on the ground of what's happened. What is this thing on the plate? There's some ways that we fool ourselves with language to hide the brutality of the food flow. And so just being really concrete about all these different words for pig, it's like, that's also a pig. That's also a pig. Like just understanding the realities behind what's happening in the food system.
Yep, it's so true. My daughter is just learning to read now, but every time we're at the store, I say, okay, come here. I turn anything we're buying processed, right? I turn it over. I'm like, look at the label. Okay. It's
Mm-hmm.
important to read it, understand what it means, because even nutritional facts, I mean, this could be a whole other episode, but
Yeah.
even nutritional facts are not 100% transparent on what's really going into it. And so you
Right.
got to read, look at the ingredients. What's in here? Is it healthy for our bodies? Is it not? And especially, does it include any milk or eggs? Obviously, we want to avoid those. But trying to teach her to understand that too, because the world, even when they think it's healthy, natural, you
Right.
still have to be that informed consumer. They're just trying to
Yeah.
get you at every turn.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you mentioning that because I feel like I haven't done that as a purposeful, like, hey, let's look at the ingredients list. But there is this norm of that always being the default, right? Like, oh, okay, let's take a look at this. Let me look at the ingredients, right? Like, it's the process of understanding a food thing is like step one in engaging with it. And so I feel like
Mhm.
both your children and mine are learning that as like, here's how we approach the world as opposed to what it's telling you on the front.
So, Salem, I'm curious to know if you have done anything around vegan activism. So there's lots of things out there in
Yeah.
real life, on the internet. Have you done anything with your kids or just yourself? And what has that experience been like?
No, my experience entering my adult life was like, this is something that I'm choosing, but it's not all of who I am. So it's a core defining aspect of my values, but I don't lead with that. If someone finds out, then great.
Mhm.
But it's not like, here's me, this is the first thing that I am. And so I think it'd be good for me at some point to maybe engage more in some form of activism, but I feel like in my head, it seems hard to engage and not turn into like that. This is me, and this is
Mhm.
what defines me almost. So,
Sure.
me, my activism is like to live very clearly in alignment and to raise my own family. And when people ask me questions, it's like role modeling more
Yeah.
than going out and preaching. Or my experience is people don't want to change if they feel judged, right? And so a lot of this
True.
history of like, look at this terrible thing and how could you do this stuff, and people just really shut down a lot. I feel like it's more, my activism is to honestly answer questions when people have them and to not like shy away from conversations, but I'd say it's like a very mellow I am not an activist. I'm just living.
Yes, yes. I love that. I love how you're saying this is a part of your life. It's a part of your identity, but it's not your whole identity. It's not consuming your whole life, which is great. And that's how it should be. It's a part of you, but there's a lot of other parts to you that make you an amazing person. I've definitely had conversations with people where they almost try to validate their own reasons for eating meat. Like,
Right.
oh, well, my body just feels better with meat, or
Right, yeah, or I tried
whatever.
it and, like, it didn't work for me. I tried it for a month and it was terrible, whatever. Yeah,
Right,
everyone's
right.
got a journey. But that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's fine, and I don't need people to be different than how they are. Like other people. I am not trying to change other people, because I feel like if you're starting from that place, it's gonna be a lot of strife, and people are often really resistant to feeling like you want them to be different than how they are. I mean, people get really defensive even if you don't even start that way. Like,
Mhm.
they'll initiate the conversation. I'm like, "I didn't tell you that I'm mad at you for eating like the chicken that you're eating here. Like, you do you." And hopefully, as you live your life, keep paying attention to whether that choice is working. Do you feel good, like ethically and physically? And to me, that's more of the lesson, and it's more subtle, but it's trying to role model that of like people paying a little closer attention.
I love that perspective too. Yeah, and that goes back, just aligns perfectly what we talked about before, which is that everyone's on their own path. And just like we as vegans don't like being judged, we're not going to do that to other people too.
Yeah.
So amazing. All right, we're going to wrap up here pretty soon. Salem, this has been such an amazing podcast. Before we part ways,
Mhm.
I want to know, coming from the lifelong vegan here, if you could give one piece of advice to anyone considering going vegan or raising their kids vegan, what would it be?
One piece of advice. I would say that it's twofold. One is that all the choices that you make matter, and don't beat yourself up about any one choice. It's just between you and what feels like the right thing, and everything else just noise. In general, I try and stick really close to the path. The other day, someone mislabeled the pizzas, and the kids ended up eating a pizza that wasn't vegan. And I didn't bring it up with them because they didn't know, and it was fine. I feel like my parents were a little more intense about how tightly they held these things. It was very egregious. And for me, I don't feel that way. I think it's important to have that strong sense of like, this really matters, and this absolutely is who I am and what I'm choosing.
Mhm.
And we're not like born to suffer. So if something happens and there's a mistake, it's really about what's going to help you thrive at every step. And it doesn't have to be hard.
Yeah. Truer words have never been spoken. Thank you so much, Salem. So much. That's amazing. And I want to thank you all, free spirits, for joining us today on Flying Upstream. We are dedicated to highlighting unconventional paths out there and making sure you know whatever your passion is in life, it is beautiful and it is worth pursuing. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Salem. And we'll see you all next time.
Thank you so much, Kristyn.
All right, free spirits, that's all the time we have for today on Flying Upstream.
We hope this episode sparked your curiosity and ignited a desire to explore the extraordinary paths less traveled.
Even when the current feels strong, a whole world of possibilities awaits.
We'll see you next time on the other side of mainstream.
So keep questioning, keep challenging, and most importantly, keep flying upstream.